How did you develop an interest in design in the first place?
If you had met me in my late teens, early 20s, you wouldn't have necessarily pegged me as someone who would go into design. There wasn't a playbook for what did it mean to be a head of design for a all-digital internet startup. Like, that just didn't exist. You were making that up as you went along.
How do you feel like the role of being a design leader has changed?
If I think back to that first role where nobody kind of knew anything, I was given a lot of freedom. That kind of freedom doesn't exist anymore. In many organizations, the product management function has too much power and not enough understanding of the potential of design. Focus on what you can control, which is how you're showing up and being your best you.
Starting as an anthropology major, Peter Merholz never planned on becoming a design pioneer. But through Adaptive Path and his influential work on design orgs, he's reshaped how we think about the profession. Today, we'll unpack his fascinating journey, from co-founding a company that helped define user experience to scaling design teams at a global level. We'll also dive into how Peter's background in anthropology has uniquely influenced his approach to human-centered design and leadership. I'm your host, Chris Abad, and this is Pixelated Path. If you're curious about building a career that bridges creativity, technology, and leadership, you'll love this conversation. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode filled with inspiring stories and actionable insights. Let's jump in. Peter, you've had a very influential career, including founding of a very well-known design firm, Adaptive Path. How did you develop an interest in design in the first place?
If you had met me in my late teens, early 20s, you wouldn't have necessarily pegged me as someone who would go into design. But while I was in school, I did have a formative experience. I think basically my senior year, my first year out of school, where I was working for a professor at the University of California at Berkeley in the School of Education, and he had on his bookshelf Information Anxiety by Richard Saul Wurman, and so I pulled it off because it looked interesting to me. And it's, this book is now almost 40 years old, but it was essentially an early information architecture book. This is Richard Saul Wurman was seen more as an information graphics guy, but created things like the Access Press and other ways to communicate through visual means, complex information. And it landed with me. I'm like, oh, I get it. This is how I think. This is how I operate in the world. And then I had another book experience a year or two later where I got to work on a CD-ROM that included the book, The Design of Everyday Things, within it by Donald Norman. And similarly, I'm like, oh, I approach the world in this way. I look at the products around me and the software and complain about how it doesn't make any sense. And the theme of that book is, it's not the fault of the user that these products don't make sense, right? It's the fault of the designers and the companies that build these things because they're not taking into account how people think and work. And so those books gave me insight that that other people were trying to solve these types of problems, which suggested to me, oh, maybe there's a future in doing that work. And then I ended up working for a design firm, but as a web developer, because that was my only marketable skill. But working in a design firm, I got exposed to kind of more formal design practice. Now, this was more like graphic design, identity design, but they were moving from kind of their print-based world into a digital world. And then I took a class in user-centered design and usability engineering. The only formal education I have in this is a semester's night class through the UC extension, and realized, oh, that's where I learned about HCI and a whole bunch of other kinds of just elements of this work, and realized, like, okay, this is a thing that you can do for a living. And from that point on, that was 97, 98, I have been active in some flavor of what we now call user experience design.
So your formal training was in anthropology, mass communications, and then...
That's my degree is in anthropology. Yeah.
Did that have any influence or bearing on some of those early years as you started to learn about information architecture or usability?
I thought I was moving away from anthropology. I studied anthropology because I enjoyed my anthro classes and I needed a degree. And I figured, well, if I have to get a degree in something, it might as well be something I'm enjoying learning. But when my last year in school and then immediately afterwards, I was doing all this work in multimedia development. And so I thought I was kind of moving away from anthropology. So it was interesting to me, though, in 97, 98, as I started embracing user-centered design. And when I took that class, some of the people we read were anthropologists who were applied anthropologists, right? Who were using their anthropology practices and frameworks in service of software development. And I was like, okay. So that thing that I learned in school that I thought I had moved away from actually is relevant now as I am approaching this design field with this, my orientation being one of user-centered design. Because I don't have, frankly, I don't have any craft design skills. I didn't go to a design school. I'm a terrible visual designer, et cetera. Where I can lean in, or what the craft or the practice that I can develop, are these user-centered design skills. And so what it suggested to me was that inclination I had as a college student towards anthropology was the same inclination I was developing as a professional towards this approach to design, rooted in understanding people.
It's so interesting. So, like in retrospect, you can sort of see the connection, but at the time, like it was not by design, this shift from
No,
anthropology into user-centered design.
not at all. Not at all. It was, I'd always liked computers and using computers, but I was never all that interested in programming computers. And I felt like the only way that you could work in computers is if you were a programmer. And I'm like, well, I didn't study computer science or whatever. And so as I started to realize, though, that there was a way to work in computers that didn't involve programming them, and that really started happening with multimedia and multimedia CD-ROMs, and then we get to the web. I found like this, I don't know, this little sweet spot in between the things that I was interested in where I could operate. And then eventually found out or figured out that yes, anthropology is relevant to the work that I'm doing.
And I mean, around this time, so you went from multimedia development to web development. Like even when you started finding literature around like HCI or user-centered development, like that role was not super well established. So how
No.
did you go about finding like work or like creating that role for yourself? Did it just sort of like fall together, or like you don't? There was no defined career path because it didn't exist. And so, what was that like for you in those
Yeah.
early years?
Yeah. So I mentioned I worked at a design firm. It was called Studio Archetype, and I was a web developer for a year. And during that year, I took that night class in user-centered design. And after that class, I told the leadership at this design firm, I don't want to be a web developer. I want to be an interaction designer, because I just found out what that was. And they said, okay, that sounds like a thing we could use, given we're doing more and more digital experiences, mostly web-based experiences. So I was an interaction designer there for my second year. And then I had been active on kind of community mailing lists. That was a thing back in the time. Before we had Slack, if you wanted to be online with people in your profession, you were part of what were called listservs. And there was a local community of people doing web development and web design that I was active on, and here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And other people in this community were running a smaller design firm, but that was focused on web design. They didn't do any traditional design. And they recruited me and hired me because they liked what I had to say and how I was approaching things differently than what they were doing. And I did some work with them. And that was like my first formal, like, I got a job doing this kind of stuff. But I then left there. I was independent for a little while. Because I am who I am, early on, I was blogging about interaction design and kind of finding a community out in the world through that. I applied to and was accepted to speak at a couple conferences. So I was speaking about it. And so because of that, I was able to find freelance work, essentially doing this type of thing for a little while. And then the freelance work, I landed a job as what we would now call a head of design, but then we called it a creative director for a startup in 1999. So a Web 1.0 era startup. That was my first management role. And the reason I got that job was they were familiar with like the stuff I'd written and spoken about. And through some networking, I was able to get that job. And then once I was kind of done with that job, which only lasted a little over a year, I started Adaptive Path. This was at the end of 2000, beginning of 2001. So a weird time for our industry, but had developed a set of connections with other people in the industry through these various community efforts. Again, speaking at conferences, writing, that kind of thing, and realized there was a few of us who were in a similar spot in our career where we weren't necessarily happy where we were. We didn't quite know what was next. And so we thought, well, why don't we make what's next? There seems to be a need for user experience as a practice in the world. And let's start a company that provides that as a service. That's what we did.
I want to come back to some of those early days of Adaptive Path, but you had mentioned just before that you had your first role as a manager, and I want to talk a little bit about that because you talk so much now about like leadership and design, and so I just want to talk a little bit about what that was like for you to first move into a management role, and like how did that come about? Because it sounds like you're still sort of also in a mode where you're figuring out even what this job is as it's sort of forming in the industry. And here you are on top of that.
And they liked what I had to say. They liked my approach to design. So they hired me as again, we called the role creative director, but we would now call it head of design. And it was clear I was going to need to build a team to do all the work that was needed to be done. And so, it's long enough ago that I can't remember exactly how I went about it, but I do remember some things that I still take from to this day when I think about leadership and management. But, cobbled together a team. I made sure that the team had some breadth of experience, right? So people who were more visually minded, people who were more systems minded, even somebody who was a little more on the research side. We were all designers, but we could kind of cover different types of design work. So that was important. I was fortunate to have a really good boss, this guy, Joel Truer. He was our essentially chief product officer. Again, I don't know what his title was at the time. And he made space for us because he had actually worked at Hotwired and WebMonkey with people. And so he had been around people who knew how to do good design. And so he made space for us to do some good design work and encouraged us not to just like paint screens, but to think about a bit more conceptually what it was we were trying to build and to make sure there was a solid foundation of what it was we were doing. So we had some space that he granted us, which was important. But the single most important thing I learned as a design leader there, which was hard for me to accept at first, is my job wasn't to do the design. My job was to make clear that as creative director that I approved of all the design. My job was to make space for my team to do their best design work. And as a new manager, one of the things that was hardest for me to accept was I didn't have to put my thumbprints on what everyone else was doing, right? I had this assumption that I needed to, at the outset, that I needed to touch all of the work so that it reflected that I was involved in the design and that I was doing my job by touching other people's work. And I realized pretty quickly, they're all better designers than I am. And my job isn't to touch their work. I mean, help them make their work better, sure, but it didn't need literally my hands to keyboard or mouse in order to make it better. My job was to create a space where they were able to do their best work. My job was often, I think I learned this in this very first job, my job was to go to all the meetings that needed to be gone to so that they didn't have to go to those meetings, so that they could focus on the work. And I was going to be the one having all the conversations about the work. So that was an early learning, but that was tough because up until then, and this is true even today as a designer, right? You're valued for your work, for the things you create, for your output. And so when you get to that design leadership role, you still have that. It's like a muscle memory, right? It's just this habit that you're in that you need to keep doing the work. And it turned out that was not how I was going to deliver the most value anymore.
I imagine that means you didn't go into that job knowing what effectively the job description is. Like it's sort of turned into something maybe that you didn't
It
expect.
continued to evolve. Yeah, I mean, when I started, there was just me as the only designer, replacing a prior kind of senior designer, creative director they had. But then I was told, okay, build a team. And I think I probably knew that going in. But I was doing brand design. I hired Meta Design to be our brand agency. I was doing, I mean, I and the team, I mean, we were doing all the different kinds of design. But the company was also evolving as we're going. So yes, design needed to evolve as our vision changed, right? At first, Opinions was going to be almost like this publishing platform. There's not a current model right now, but you could think of it almost like a Quora. If you squint a little bit, like a Reddit, just like a publishing platform for whatever. But pretty quickly we realized we needed something to focus on, so it became a product review site. Okay, well that's different than what we had thought going in. So now we have to think about how do we design for a product review experience, which is different than if you're just developing a publishing platform, right? And so yeah, as I was there, things would evolve, and I had to evolve with it. And no, there wasn't a playbook for what did it mean to be a head of design for a all digital internet startup. Like that just didn't exist. You were making that up as you went along. There were other design teams in other companies. I mean, Yahoo was a thing, or Google was a thing, Netscape was a thing. They all had design teams. So like, it's not like no one else was doing web design in some fashion, but I think all of us were still figuring it out on the fly.
So the industry has evolved since then. The discipline of design has evolved since then. How do you feel like the role of being a design leader has changed for like what that role needs to be or what businesses expect out of that role versus then?
How much time you got? It's changed a lot. Well, it kind of both has changed a lot and it hasn't changed at all in some ways. If I think back to that first role where nobody kind of knew anything and we were all making it up as we went along, I was given a lot of freedom to do what I think was right in terms of leading design, and product didn't run everything kind of willy-nilly. Like design had a role. If you looked at the website, like that was what we had designed. That was like on our mock-ups was what turned into the website, as opposed to like product overly specifying how it was all going to work, that kind of thing. So there was a significant degree of freedom there. And I think the naivete, you could consider that immature, but it almost made them able to accept a more advanced design because there was this recognition that they didn't know what they didn't know. And so, Peter, if you've got a point of view and a direction you want to take us in, great, let's do that. What's happened over time is, as this has all gotten way more professionalized in the last 25 years, and there's many more standards and organizations get bigger, et cetera, that kind of freedom that I had in 1999 doesn't exist anymore, right? We've created all these guardrails, and oftentimes in ways that are harmful, right? And so, in many organizations, the product management function has kind of too much power and not enough understanding of the potential of design. And so they inadvertently, I don't think there's any ill intent, but product will end up kind of putting design in this conceptual box that really is just screen design, UI design, kind of painting the interface on whatever product is determined to be built, as opposed to really taking advantage of the fullness of design. And that's not everywhere, right? There are organizations where design has more freedom and authority to kind of flex its all of its muscles. But the biggest change, to get back to your question, probably the biggest change that has occurred in the last 25 years when it comes to design and design leadership is scale. Like we're just operating at enormous scales. The last team I supported, so I've been an independent consultant for the last 5 years, and a team I supported for the last 3 years, went from 350 UXers to 1,000 UXers, right? And like that kind of scale was unheard of 25 years ago. The largest teams that I knew of back then at places like eBay or Yahoo or Netscape or Google was like 20, 25, 40, maybe 50. And you couldn't imagine anything larger than that. And so operating at scale has a set of other factors, right? You now need to be much more responsible about business and how you're kind of thinking of your team as this investment, because there's so much money, right? You have even 200 people on your UX org, the cost per employee means that's a $10 to $20 million expense. Like I'd have to do the math, but like it's a lot of money. And so like we weren't thinking about that back then. I can tell you, we might be thinking about like, metrics and like, how do we connect? Yeah. The operating at scale is probably the single most important change, which then has implications like better understanding business, being a better leader, being a better manager, because now you're affecting more individuals within your team because of scale. It's just a whole host of things kind of comes with scale.
I want to go back to one of the other things that you mentioned earlier about what has changed. And you get these teams that are maybe more structured because, we want to be more professional about what we do. And a byproduct of that on a lot of teams is design goes from having a lot of creative freedom to sort of being put in a box. And the scope of what you're asked to do gets down to like much more tactical, like designing pixels and wireframes and pushing mocks and things like that. For someone who feels like they're stuck in that mode, for maybe an early career designer who's on a team feeling frustrated, like what advice do you have for them? Like, how do you break out of that if that is how your organization works?
That's an excellent question, and it can be really hard for that early career designer who, particularly, I remember seeing 4 or 5 years ago some like, I don't know if it was tweet threads or other kind of sharing that these early career designers were doing in social media platforms, where they were like, I went to school and learned all these amazing methods for design, and now I have a job and all I'm being asked to do is paint screens. And they were saying this as if like all that stuff you learned in school doesn't matter. This is what actually matters if you get a design job, which is heartbreaking for someone like me who thinks that those methods that you learn in school do matter, but to hear that in so many contexts no one knows how to take advantage of it. And what to do. It's so contingent on the environment you're in terms of what you'll have kind of permission to do. Hopefully you're in an environment where the constraints on design are inadvertent, right? People didn't know any better. They didn't know design had all this opportunity and potential to not just do kind of pixel pushing, but to design the systems underneath it, the structural, the navigational, the kind of flows and all that, maybe even to go deeper and through research and strategy to help figure out what the opportunities were. And so if you're in an environment where that narrowing isn't one of real intent, but just kind of, it's just what happened. I actually was thinking about looking at this earlier today, right? This book, written by my podcast partner, Jesse James Garrett, 20 years ago? I don't know, a while ago. And it's based on a diagram that's now almost 25 years old. This is over 20 years ago, 2003. Though this is the first edition. There was a second edition, I forget when that was written. But it talks about all the kind of components of user experience. And so if you're one of those early career designers trying to communicate to other people, hey, there's more that I could deliver. That's actually really why Jesse wrote this book. It's not that thick. It's the language is very direct and straightforward, and it's meant to show all user experience can be involved in. And hopefully tools like that can help you speak to your boss or others around you and say, hey, there's more to this work than what I'm currently being asked to do. And then you would identify maybe some new initiative, a project, a feature, or something that's coming up. And you could say, hey, let's try working in a different way on that problem. Let's do a little bit of research, or let's do some, site map or flow mapping before diving into screens or whatever it is. And hopefully you're in an environment where there's some willingness to accept these new ways of working, and you ease in. You don't do the full process in that next initiative. You do a little piece, and then when people are like, oh, well, that was better than how we used to do it, and you're like, oh, you thought that was good. What if we do a little bit more and a little bit more? And over time, you're able to bring in a fuller design practice. The thing I will say is there are environments where it is intentional, where all they want from their product designers is that tip of the iceberg. And then you have to figure out, is that a place for you, right? If you've got desires to practice design in a richer fashion, you might need to find a different environment to do so. I know that's easy to say, not as easy to make happen, and particularly in this current kind of hiring market. But that would be something to start to recognize, that if you're in an environment where you're not able to do that fullness of design, don't assume that's true everywhere else. There are environments where you do get to work, you do get to perform more robustly as a designer, and find out where those are. Put little alerts on LinkedIn or whatever when there's job postings, or if you know someone at those companies, reach out to those places. You might have to leave your current environment. And it'll take you a while to figure out just what you can do. But if after 6 to 9 months, you're just not getting any traction trying to evolve your practice within that organization, that's likely a sign that you're going to have to go elsewhere to do that.
Yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit, because earlier, we talked a little bit about your time at ePinions, and then after that is when you started Adaptive Path. And you mentioned a little bit about some of the motivation there, both the need of the market and maybe the frustration on your part. What was there a grand vision in the beginning for Path? Like how much did what Adaptive Path turned out to be lined up with what you set out to accomplish in the first place?
There was a vision. We had to build one. Like so there were 7 founders of Adaptive Path, which is a lot. And we all knew we were interested in exploring this user experience space and from different angles. But we knew we had something in common, because we met through places like South by Southwest or these other conferences where we were either on stage or kind of very active and engaged participants. And so as we started talking with one another about what would a company that we build look like, we had a vision, and that vision, more of a mission than a vision. And the mission was to advance the field of user experience. Like, we actually saw that as the mission of the company, was to advance the field of user experience. And the way we were going to do that, we knew before we launched, there were going to be 3 different vehicles for that. There was going to be consulting, which was going to be out of the gate, right? We knew that we needed to generate revenue. So we were going to start with consulting, because you can immediately have money coming in for work that you do. Then we knew there was going to be events. We had met at events. We liked events. We saw opportunity for events that we would want to do. And then we were going to do publications. We were all writers. Some of us had written books by that point. But even in those who hadn't written books, were blogging or otherwise with communicating through the written word. And so we saw publications, and there were some models out there for this. And so we had that plan. It was a 3-year plan. And by the end of the 3rd year, we had done all of those things. We'd launched consulting. Year 2, we'd launched events. Year 3, we launched publications. So then we were like, now what? The mission still held of advancing the field of user experience. And we then learned things like, you know what? A publications business is really hard. And so we actually let that, after, I don't even know if it was a full year, we published 5 or 6 reports. It was really hard to get traction. It was really hard to figure out. It was a lot of work to do, and then it wasn't bearing fruit the way we imagined it. And so we let that slide. We still wrote on our blog, and we wrote essays, so we had other ways of communicating. but we didn't have a pillar in our business around publishing. And so we were focused on consulting and events. And about 5 years in, we're like, you know what? This would have been 2006, where it's like, we'd come out of the doldrums of the dot bust. We had grown we had added one employee a year in 2003, 4, and 5. So we were like, or 2003 and 4, we were like 9 maybe employees, maybe 10. And we realized the opportunity was greater. And so we actually at the end of year 5 checked in with ourselves and said, you know what, let's see where this can go. And we had a vision. The mission was still to advance the field of user experience, but we decided to remove some of our shackles that were self-imposed and start growing the company and see kind of what the opportunity was to really advance the field, to bring more voices into the company, to have a bigger, greater conversation about user experience. By scaling, we could touch more client companies and thus have more impact in user experience. We thought that would also help us grow our events business, which was another vehicle for like impact at scale. But it was all around advancing the field of user experience. That was the primary mission. After a while, in about 2009 or 10, we changed it. And in retrospect, it feels a little cliched, but at the time it felt somewhat original. And around 2009 or 10, or maybe 2008 or 9, we changed the vision to be, improve people's lives was key to it, right? So like deliver user experiences that improve people's lives. We no longer were focused on advancing the field of user experience. We shifted towards how are we making an impact on people out in the world, not just our industry. So we did have a shift in vision about 6 or 7 years in.
You said something I found interesting, and I just want to double back on it a little bit. So this is still relatively early in your career. You had like your first leadership role at ePinions, and then for about a year, and then you start your own business. So you're brand new entrepreneur, first time business founder. You get together a rather large group of founders who all have strong opinions because they're all like either speakers or written books. Like everyone sort of has things that they're very knowledgeable and passionate about. You sit down and you write a 3-year business plan. And then 3 years later, everything plays out the way that you predicted. Like, how did that like that alone, I think for a lot of first-time business owners is like, what do you think your secret was? Because that's quite unusual, right?
So our secret was we spent 5 or 6 months before launching figuring out what we wanted to be. There was a lot of conversation leading up to it. And I think really kind of going over and over and over again what it was we wanted to be helped predispose us to this plan is a good one and one that we will see through. A lot of that work in that 5 to 6 months was aligning on values, right? Do we all share the same desires? Even though we have different perspectives and different interests and different kind of points of view with respect to the nature of the work, that's underneath that at a more foundational level, we realized we had an extremely aligned set of values. And one of the benefits of that was it meant that not that we weren't going to keep arguing or discussing things, but with that sense of shared values, we could kind of get to resolutions quicker. Because if we didn't all agree, we kind of were like, it's okay if most people are thinking this and I'm the holdout, you know what? I'm going to be okay with it because I know that we all share the same values and they seem to think this is the way to go. And I'm not going to stop it. I'm not going to be the one to kind of get in the way of that. And so we were able to act with that kind of confidence that whatever any of us did was for the good of the organization because we had that shared value system. The other thing that's worth pointing out is like we were operating in a consulting business, and consulting business, essentially, that was the lion's share throughout Adaptive Path's entire life. Consulting was the lion's share of the revenue. I think events at its largest maybe was 20% of our revenue. And consulting businesses, that's a mature business, like a mature kind of way to do business. there's not a lot you can innovate there or like go in weird directions with consulting. And we tried. Talk about that if you're interested in. But I think one of the reasons we could have a 3-year business plan and execute against it was because we weren't doing something novel from the standpoint of the nature of our offering. User experience maybe was novel in terms of having a consulting firm dedicated to user experience. But there were design firms. I had worked at Studio Archetype, and we typically competed against what were called design firms. So that was pretty well understood. There were usability consultancies even at the time. What made us distinct is that we talked about user experience, which wasn't a phrase that was usually talked about from a consulting context. But anything else about us was pretty straightforward. It's not like we were a startup with a new product that we were going to bring to market. And, as you learn what what customers really want, every year you're pivoting and shifting, trying to find product market fit. That was not going to be a problem for us.
So I have to ask, what were some of the maybe weirder ways that you tried to innovate on the offering that maybe didn't work out?
Yeah. Our utilization rate was about 60%, which is very low for a consulting company. Most consulting companies try to have a utilization rate anywhere from 90 to over 100%. But we kept our utilization rate low so that we recognize, we were interested in being thought leaders, and we also recognized that's why people came to us. So it was kind of a marketing expense. And so by being billable 60% of the time, the other 40%, for us as leaders, there's enough running the company, there's sales and other things that we had to do. And I forget how we translated all of this, but we always made sure that we protected time for thinking and writing and communicating and that kind of stuff. So that was probably the key weirdness. I remember, when we were maybe 20 some people, 2006 or 7, we started growing, but we weren't, the largest we got was almost 50 in 2000. But as we were growing, I remember talking to people at other companies who assumed we were much larger, right? They thought we must have 100 or 200 people because we had so many people writing on our website. And in their companies, they would be, maybe 5 to 10% of the employees would have a public voice. Literally every employee at Adaptive Path had a public voice. And so that was weird that we invested that much time and effort into being thought leaders. And I say that a little sheepishly, but actually not as sheepishly as I normally do when I use that phrase thought leader, because it's a weird phrase, but that was definitely core to who we were. And so that was probably the most important, or the biggest delta between how a normal consulting company runs and how we were running, was trying to keep hours low so that we could protect time for thought leadership and events, because we felt those were important. And frankly, so I left Adaptive Path in 2011, and this is after the financial crisis, and then we came out of that, and we were doing fine, but it became very clear in 2010, 2011, that the future of Adaptive Path was as a responsible consulting firm. And responsible meant, we're going to have to up our utilization rate, right? We're going to have to ask people to be billable 80%, 85%, and that kind of thing. And I got it. I was one of the shareholders and owners of the business. I'm like, that is exactly what Adaptive Path should do. And I don't want to be involved with that anymore. That's not interesting to me to work that way. And so I made my exit at the end of 2011 and I went in-house around that time. And that was true for many of the founders. Many had already left by then, but none of us were interested in being part of a normal consulting company. The more and more it became clear, there's a reason consulting operates the way it does, and it's really hard to push against those patterns. We all found other things to do.
So that sort of brings around a second chapter of Adaptive Path and who they were. And I know that happens with many companies. They go through different phases of their life cycle. But certainly in that earlier life cycle, I feel like Adaptive Path was able to have a big impact on the field of user experience, even if you change the mission, I think that happened. Where do you feel like you all made the biggest impact on this profession?
I'm thinking about that. because I don't have a glib answer. I think we made the biggest impact on the profession by contributing to it feeling like an actual profession, a function, a discipline. I think in 2001, when we started, user experience was an idea. Some companies had user experience teams, though that was not all that common. It would, be called, like design firms, almost none of them had user experience teams. And internally, it would be like the interaction design team or the interface design team or the software design team or something like that. So I think the biggest impact was giving shape to this idea of user experience design as a credible function with a set of practices and ways of working and all that. Now, and we weren't the only ones. There was a lot of other people developing this. Nielsen Norman Group kind of pivoted away from usability. Like Jacob pivoted away from usability and really into user experience around this time and started working with Don Norman and building up his practice. Jared Spool started talking much more about user experience in his practice. And so there were others who were also trying to kind of bring shape to this. But we were definitely kind of helping legitimize this, such that now, user experience design or, product design, there's other kind of terms for it. Like, it's just a real thing that's not really all that questioned. And I think we played a part in that development. That's probably the single biggest thing. Because and that's because we were always willing to share how we worked. We wrote about how we worked. We taught classes in how we worked. We wanted to be as open source as possible in our practice.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit next, and I want to talk about your book. So in 2016, almost 10 years ago, you wrote this book, Org Design for Design Orgs. Even to this day, I think for a lot of design leaders, it's a resource about like how to think about the organizational structure of your team. Certainly for me, it was eye-opening and certainly how I developed a lot of my first ideas about how to think about design. Where did the inspiration for it come from?
So I had left Adaptive Path and I moved in-house and I became a design executive. And I worked at a startup for right after Adaptive Path that lasted about 8 months. And then for various reasons, I ended up leaving there and I ended up joining Groupon. And this was at the time that Groupon was always kind of going through its throes, but it had grown very quickly. And its its product development teams were still on a growth path. And so I was brought in as the VP of Global Design, and I ended up taking a team that I inherited, which was about 25 people, and over about a year and a quarter, maybe a year and a half, grew that from 25 to about 55, almost 60. And that was just to meet the internal demand for design. And I had no idea what I was doing in terms of scaling a team in that way. I had scaled Adaptive Path, so I knew kind of what it looked like to scale a design organization. But an in-house design team is quite different from a consultancy design team. And so I had to make it up as I went along, and I'm a fairly reflective practitioner. And so my practice was being a design executive. And so I was just being very mindful about how am I going to do this. And I had a vision. I wanted to create a design team that would deliver on the end-to-end service experience for our shoppers and our merchants. And so that vision of end-to-end coherent experience drove the decisions I was making in terms of how we structured the teams and all that kind of stuff. But then I had to do things like, I need to create a leveling framework. I need to create performance evaluation. The HR gave me the performance evaluation tools that we would use. And I'm like, this makes no sense for design. So can I rewrite it that, like, I can keep the same themes maybe, but like the specifics are tailored to what we seek in terms of better designer performance? And they said, sure. Right. And so again and again, I would realize like standard operating procedure in these companies was either ignorant of design, was always ignorant of design. And that would either have like kind of a whatever effect, or it could be actually actively negative effect. I would see certain practices like performance evaluations where I'm like, if we followed this, I would lose good designers because of what we're evaluating for.
What were for?
And so it's been a while, but there was just, I remember like a sweating of details, a care in process, quality and craft, and those types of things were not anything that was at least in the evaluations that I had. I just, I'm losing sight of the details at that time, but I've seen again and again where the standard corporate structures, evaluations or professional development structures just don't map to what we're looking for in design. One of the things is oftentimes these structures are very narrow and straitjacketing. So once you're in, like if you're a product designer, God forbid you ever do any user research because that's not in your job description, or that's not like a skill that we're expecting you to develop. And I'm like, well, no, we need cross-pollinate and we need cross-training and all that kind of stuff. So what I ended up doing as this design executive was having to take things that I was given and change them to suit what I needed. Also, I'm thinking about how am I scaling this organization to deliver on this end-to-end experience when my product partners are very siloed, right? They're like, I'm in charge of gifting and all I care about is gifting. And I'm in charge of personalization and all I care about is personalization. I am in charge of the shopping basket and all I care about is the shopping basket. And I'm like, well, I'm in charge of this end-to-end experience. So like all that stuff has to hang together. And so my design team is going to work to make sure that all of your silos don't feel like they're, 38 different companies, but one organization. And so that affected how I structured the organization, how I hired, the relationship between people in the organization. This is all to answer your question about the book. So I would continue to speak at events about what I was up to. People would invite me to speak. And what I started speaking about was the work I was doing as a design executive, because I'm like, this is my work now. I hope this resonates. I don't know. I thought it would be interesting for folks, even who weren't design executives, to know this is what a design executive deals with, just so you have, regardless of where you are in the organization, some awareness of what that person's up to, because it will affect you. And as I started speaking about this stuff, I was getting overwhelmingly positive feedback. Not just about, the solutions that I arrived at or whatever. Mostly it was about, oh my God, no one else is talking about this and someone needs to start talking about this because now I'm leading a team of 30 people, or I'm leading a team of 15 people, or I'm leading a team of 40 people, and there's nowhere to turn to know how to do this better. And so that was the sign, okay, we've reached this stage in our industry's evolution. There's enough organizations at enough scale that it warrants having some guidelines or playbook or whatever you want to call it to help people know how to do that job, to how to design their organizations. And similarly, so in parallel, so that book is co-written with Kristen Skinner, and she was someone I had worked with at Adaptive Path. She had stayed with Adaptive Path through its acquisition of Capital One. So she was seeing a scaling design organization in that regard. Capital One, when Adaptive Path was acquired, was maybe just about a little under 100 designers, but then they were scaling rapidly so that a year later, 2 years later, they were at like 250, 300 designers. So she was also seeing these challenges, and in her, I don't know if she was doing much speaking and writing, but her communications, realizing, okay, there's a need. So both of us in our distinct contexts were like, there's something here. We had collaborated together. I was the design lead. She was the program lead back at Adaptive Path on certain projects. So we're like, let's work together, put together an outline, shipped it around. O'Reilly was interested, and we wrote the book. But it was really in response to hearing from others out there that there was a gap in the conversation that what we were saying was helping fill.
I think at what point we talked earlier, and you were considering doing a second edition. And I don't. Did you ever work on that, or is that still something that you're thinking about?
So yeah, no is the short answer. I have continued to write. So if you go to petermerholz.com, I continued. Well, First, if you go to orgdesignfordesignорgs.com, there's some writing there after we wrote the book, just as our ideas continued to develop. Then when I launched my business in 2019 as an independent consultant and petermerholz.com, that's where I've focused my writing. So I continue to think about org matters. I write a lot about org design. I present a lot about org design. I am not planning on turning that into a book anytime soon. I am planning on some form of maybe training and courses and that kind of stuff, Maven style cohort based courses with some things that I've developed. I teach one kind of already focused on career development, career paths, career frameworks. I currently only teach it at the Design Ops Summit. I'm going to find some other opportunities. So I think writing a book is hard. And writing a second edition to that book, like this book is not even 200 pages. If I were to write a second edition that I felt good about, it would probably be 3 times as thick. Just, I know so much more about design orgs than I did 8 years ago, particularly scaled design orgs. That book kind of taps out at a design org of about 60 or 70 with this assumption that, like, if it's beyond that, it's like the 60-person org, only more so. I have since realized, like, oh no, to be a design org of 150 is interestingly different. To be a design org of 500 is interestingly different. Possibly to be a design org of 1,000. I haven't thought a lot about that, but to be a design org of 1,000 is different again. So like, whether it's that much more robust career, like the career development chapter is a good place to start, but I got much more advanced thinking there. Recruiting and hiring as a practice, particularly as we've become much more aware of matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That book touches on at the lightest bit, diversity as this concept, but there's so much more to say about how do you structure your recruiting and hiring processes to be. Just a few things off the top of my head. Marketing design, we really kind of punted on in that book. There's the relationship between marketing and product design is worth exploring and expanding and figuring out the distinction between design for specific, let's say, verticals, features, products, and design for horizontals, platform design, like design systems. That's a new development that wasn't really something that we thought we're thinking about 8 or 9 years ago, but is worth addressing. So there's a lot more to unpack. And instead of writing a book, I think I'd rather like pick off topics like I've been rattling and write a little bit about it, teach a class about it, and then maybe 5 to 10 years from now, I'll have enough material that it can just kind of turn into a book, but not planning on sitting down and writing a second edition anytime soon.
Some of the things around like hiring practices, and initially I didn't even consider that as a part of, as a design executive, how you think about organization design. But of course, the inputs into that, into what your team is, then influence like the team you're building and how it's structured. And so I want to ask this because I know this is, you're doing a course on career development. You and I have talked a little bit about like hiring. You mentioned earlier, like the market right now is quite strange. What do you think happens to hiring practices in a situation like that? Like, for example, if you're thinking about all these best practices of diversity and inclusion and how you hire and stuff like that, but right now we have fewer jobs out there than we have in a long time. A lot of teams are stressed because of layoffs. A lot of the recruiting teams are stressed also because of layoffs. Jobs are incredibly competitive, so just far too many applicants and then these teams can even look at. Like, how do you maintain like some of those healthy practices that you talk about in a situation like that? Is it even possible?
Oh, it's definitely possible. Whether or not companies are doing it is another matter, because one of my biggest realizations around recruiting and hiring is that most companies are way too fast and loose about it. And so any recommendation that I'm going to bring is going to say, hey, you should do a bunch more thinking ahead of time on the nature of the role, the actual skills that you need, what are the activities of that role going to be? Like, really think about develop a strong profile of the role, and then as you engage with candidates, interview them in a structured, robust way so that you're making sure that you're interviewing against these skills that or criteria that you've defined, right? All of this stuff is more work. And companies are like, why would I do more work when I can post a job description, get 400 applicants, talk to 5 of them over the course of a week and hire one on, a week later or whatever. And point taken, but you're not going to hire as well. You're not going to hire fairly. You might as well get the most out of this opportunity instead of just like taking what comes. And so, the challenge I've had as I've advised companies around recruiting and hiring practices is to try to find a sweet spot of rigor, but not overbearingness, right? Because I've also seen when HR gets involved and they put like lockdown on these processes and there's not enough, there's no room for flexibility. There's no, and the process isn't tailored to design. Like I've had companies who, you hear about this less and less, but when I started doing this type of consulting, they're like, we don't know about portfolio reviews. Like no other function does that. And is that really necessary? And I'm like, it's design. It's super necessary. like this is how we know what people are doing. But like you sometimes had to introduce these things into these, again, very locked down environments. So I've seen the whole spectrum of kind of, again, rigor is not quite the right word, but just like from way open, like super Wild West, just like, yeah, talk to 3 people. And, if the hiring manager likes them, then they just extend an offer to HR running literally vetting every question that every interviewer asks the participant. And that question has to come from a database of pre-approved questions. Or if you want new questions, you have to go through a 2-week approval process. That said, the thing that I unexpectedly arrived at coming out of this thing is that I would rather err on the side of rigor and repeatability and structure than on the side of openness, because openness is anathema to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it allows for so much of the individuals into the process and so much of their biases into the process that it will likely be unfair. And the more structured approaches, what they bring you through that repeatability, through that clarity of the profile and asking the right questions to get at those things, is fairness. And fairness should, removing bias, and it's only so much that can be removed, but the goal is, how do we remove bias so that we're engaging the candidates honestly and with who they are, and it's equitable in terms of their how they show up through the process. And you need more structure than you probably need more structure than you think to make that happen.
What about the other side of the table, or I guess nowadays it's more often like the other side of the screen, for someone who's early in their career, going through these interview processes, knowing, having seen a lot of how different companies run these, is there any information that someone could take away that would help them be better positioned to succeed in the interview process or stand out, knowing how companies are evaluating them?
It's hard to make a blanket statement because to answer that question, it's so contingent on how a company structures their process. And as I was just suggesting, they all structure it differently. So I could give you some guidance on how to show up for an interview, but it might not apply depending on how a particular company is running it. To that end, what's probably most important is, if you are talking to a company, you're in the early stages of talking to a company about in some type of recruiting and hiring process, try to understand as much as you can about the process ahead of time, about what they're looking for ahead of time, about the criteria by which they are going to make those decisions ahead of time, so that you can tailor how you show up to what you understand to be what they're looking for. But again, you do that for one company. If you were to then not ask and just show up that way for another company, it might be totally wrong for how they're running their process, how they're making decisions. And so it's a little bit, I guess, incumbent on the candidate to try to do some homework to better understand what those, I guess at the heart is how are they going to make their hiring decision? If you, as a candidate, can get someone to answer that question, that'll get you 2/3 of the way there in terms of understanding how to show up for company X. And then same thing, ask that question at company Y, you'll likely get a somewhat different answer. So then you'll know, oh, okay, I show less. They just want to see shiny screens. I show less process. This company wants to see a lot of process. So I'm going to show like whatever it is, but it'll be different for every company you're talking to.
Interesting. Is there, I mean, is there maybe like a shortcut or something that someone could learn that would help them quickly classify, like, oh, this is this type of company, or they're looking for, they make this type of decision, or they're looking for this type of designer?
My thought there, so probably no, considering it's taking me this long to think through it. My thought there is, so some people watching this may be familiar with, and if you're not, you should be familiar with Hang Xu. Hang, Hang, Xu, Xu. He's on LinkedIn. He's a recruiter. He's a former product designer turned recruiter. And there was a period about a year ago now where he was diving deep into the question of design maturity, because what he was seeing as a recruiter, that was the most important predictor of anything within this process, how the client was going to, or the hiring company was going to structure their process, what they were looking for in their process, what the person would be doing once they're in that organization. The single kind of greatest indicator was maturity, was how well does this company understand the value of design, the potential of design? Where are they at in their maturity curve? And you could use, the Nielsen-Norman. It's probably the best kind of standard UX maturity model out there if you just need a framework for thinking about design maturity. But to use that to try to understand your potential employers so that you get a sense of like where they're at, and then that will give you a clue if you're having trouble getting anything else out from them of how to frame how you show up. A less mature company is going to want to see a lot of shiny visuals. They're going to want sexy brands. I mean, I'm being somewhat stereotyping here, but they're not going to want to see a lot of process and a lot of rigor, and they're not going to want to hear how you pushed back on product management or whatever, because that might not be how they're running. There might be an organization where product runs things at this point. I mean, you have a separate question of like, once you understand an organization's maturity, which ones do you want to work for? But sometimes you don't have a choice. You just need to work. So yeah, figuring out how that level of maturity of that organization. And one of the nice things, depending on if you do, like, I'm hopeful that the people running the recruiting process, the recruiters, are at least able to engage in a conversation with the candidates and help the candidates understand these questions. And what's nice about that Nielsen-Norman maturity model, if you click in a bit, and I don't have it at hand, there's 6 levels, but there's 4 criteria, right? Strategy and craft, and I forget the other 2, but there's these 4 criteria. So a company might be really good at strategy and low on craft, or really good at craft and low on business sense, or whatever it is. If you can use those details in your conversation with the recruiter, you might get a better sense on like, okay, I should emphasize this, de-emphasize that. Gives you some clue for how to navigate those conversations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And even thinking back to interviews that I've gone through myself, being able to quickly do a bucketing or categorization of maturity for that organization, and then using that to kind of know what they're going to care about, the types of things they're going to want to see, and reverse engineering the scorecard that they may have in their head, using that to, in your answers, what you emphasize, what you show in your portfolio, that makes a lot of sense. And I can even think back to times for myself where perhaps I showed things that weren't as important to them, like in a portfolio presentation, because maybe I misjudged how that organization worked or what they cared about. And I do think a lot of that stems from design maturity. That's really awesome tip.
Yeah. I think at the heart of it, so do your best to assess the maturity of the organization that you're working with, but also don't beat yourself up or get yourself wrapped around an axle trying to be all things to all people. I tend to believe like if you do nothing else but show up as your truest you with the work you do, the things you care about in the work you do, the successes you've had, the challenges you faced getting to some outcome, whatever it is, and how you learned and grew, the best if all you do is show who you are to the best of your ability, that I think, how they decide is up to them, right? And that's something out of your control. You can try to understand it and you can, shape it a bit. Focus on what you can control, which is how you're showing up and being your best you. And if you're not hired, there's 1,000 reasons. Right now, there's all this competition for roles, but that might be a sign that they realized you are great, just not great for us, right? Like it's not about you not getting the job. It should never be seen as you are lesser than. There's a reason, and I'm very particular about language. There's a reason we talk about fit, right? It's not that you're worse than, lesser than, not as good at. It's not right fit, right? And so, and they're going to have their ways of determining what fit means to them. And if you're not fitting with that, that's not your fault, right? And so the challenge then, yes, you have to find the company where the fit is right. But I get concerned when folks feel like they keep getting passed over or not getting job offers, that they think that they are somehow bad at design or lesser than. And in my experience, that's never the case. It's just you have the things that we feel we need at this moment and in the foreseeable future. So then other candidates we're talking to.
Yeah. It is so easy to fall into that trap of assuming that hiring decision is a single scale and you either clear the bar or you fall below the bar. And it's as simple as that.
Right. Like if you're above the bar, then you could get a job anywhere. And if you're below the bar, then no one will ever hire you. That is not how hiring works.
Mm-hmm. I think showing up as your authentic self is such a great bit of advice and almost a bit of a filter. It reminds me of, you were talking earlier about one of the reasons why you felt Adaptive Path worked out so well is because the founders had such great values alignment and like you talking about fit and showing up as your true self, and that will be right for the right company feels a little bit like a way to make sure that you have values alignment with where you land.
I think that's exactly right.
Very cool. I want to thank you so much for this conversation. That was amazing. And I want to wrap up on that note. I think that was such a great bit of advice for people are going through that interview process now and maybe struggling with some of those questions. So that was super helpful. Where can people find you and continue to follow your work online? I know there's quite a few places that you've mentioned throughout this conversation. One or two places that you would point people to?
Yes. So I am most active on LinkedIn. I post there. And so that's, if you're interested in more of the kinds of things I've had to say, follow me there. I have petermerholz.com. Where that is most active is as a blog right now. I am hopeful that this year I will be doing more ways of connecting with folks, such as classes. So stay tuned for more information to come. That'll be in a month or two, I think. But yeah, LinkedIn or petermerholz.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Peter.
Thank you, Chris. My pleasure.
And that wraps our conversation with Peter Merholz. From his unexpected start in design to the founding of Adaptive Path, Peter's story offers so much for anyone looking to grow in the world of design and leadership. His advice on navigating design careers and building teams with a human-centered focus is truly invaluable. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next inspiring journey we share. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Bond, and we'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.